The new book, Davos Man, How the Billionaires Devoured the World, exposes the global billionaire class's hidden impact on nearly every aspect of modern society. By profiling 5 representative Davos men, author Peter S. Goodman chronicles how the 1%'s shocking exploitation of the global pandemic has hastened a 50-year trend of wealth centralization. Peter Goodman is European economics correspondent for the New York Times. He joins us now to expand on his new book. Welcome to Rising.
Thanks very much for having me.
Now, Peter, this book sounds right up my alley. Can you tell us what the central conceit is here? What don't we know about how the billionaires have been aggregating all of this wealth disproportionately over time?
Well, look, the story of inequality and money to interest pulling the levers of democracy toward their own interests, that's a familiar story. But we're now in the middle of a global public health catastrophe, and it's worth some meditation on the fact that it's been enhanced, intensified, and perpetuated by the reality that we've got a global economy that's been engineered to send more wealth to a handful of people who have the power. This is the group of people I refer to as Davos Man, to essentially write the rules in their own interests. And we can see this in many ways. I mean, just take Steve Schwarzman, who is the CEO of Blackstone, the founder of Blackstone, the world's largest private equity company, who in the run-up to the pandemic was sinking billions of dollars into the American healthcare system as part of a wave of the investor class, turning healthcare into a part of our life that is functioning like most other businesses. You know, they reduce capacity in order to jack up the prices, the same way your airline wants all the seats to be full, hospital rooms are supposed to be full. That's how we went into a pandemic, the worst pandemic in 100 years, having lost roughly a third of all the hospital rooms in the United States over the last 2 decades. And, that's why we have Omicron, because we've essentially lived through this period where a handful of pharmaceutical executives have monopolized publicly financed research to sell the wares. And we should be grateful for those vaccines, but they've sold them to the highest bidders around the world. They've priced most of humanity out. So most of humanity is unprotected. And the result is all of us are now subsidizing the monopoly profits of pharmaceutical executives with shuttered schools and continued hits to our livelihoods and fear and death.
Well, yeah, and that's the kind of difficult thing with some of this, because I don't. The vaccines are great. It's good that Amazon exists and it's easy to order things. There are ways in which these services, the products provided by these people who've gotten wealthy, providing them, are good and necessary, and we're grateful for them. But then we don't want to see them, profiting in some backhanded way, or then using, those profits to push for government policies that harm the rest of us, or keep us trapped or something like that.
Well, here's the worst part of it, right? It's not enough that Davos Man, this species of human that refers to the billionaire class, has monopolized the gains of modern capitalism at everyone else's detriment. They actually would like us to buy into them as our saviors. Mark Benioff, who's the CEO of Salesforce, this huge Silicon Valley tech company, last year at the gathering of the World Economic Forum in Davos, actually said CEOs are the heroes of the pandemic. He wasn't talking about frontline medical workers and other essential workers, people laboring in senior citizens' homes. CEOs, he said, are the heroes of the pandemic. And this is not a gaffe. He was talking about vaccines. He was talking about financiers delivering credit to prevent bankruptcies. He specifically said the government didn't save you. We saved you, and not for profit, but to save the world. That's not a gaffe. That's a worldview. That's an indication that Davos Man, the billionaire class, uses this kind of messianic posture to tell us, we've got this. You don't have to pay taxes. And guess what? Not paying taxes helps Davos Man more than anybody else. We'll take care of your problems at a time when it's clear that our problems are actually being exacerbated by the way our economy is set up.
Yeah, there's 2 things here. I mean, on the left, MMTers often are frustrated when people like Bernie talk about taxing the rich, because they're like, you don't need to tax to pay for things. However, the point that's often made is there are benefits to taxing the rich because, to your point, people who have these enormous sums of money use them to lobby for the interest of their class, right? And so that's one piece of it. The other piece of it is that I find that when having these conversations, while people kind of abstractly are invested in this idea that the rich are exploiting the halls of Congress to their own ends, a lot of Americans are still invested in the idea that the very, very rich aren't taking from them, that it's not a zero-sum game, and that they shouldn't begrudge Jeff Bezos' wealth, as though that wealth isn't coming from the exploitation of his workers and labor that's created by his workers. Do you talk about in the book at all about the relationship between the rise in productivity that hasn't correlated with the rise in raises and the enormous explosion of wealth among the hyper-rich?
Yeah, very much so. And I think you're right to construct it the way you do. I mean, it's not that we should be troubled that Jeff Bezos is making a fortune while his warehouse workers are not doing as well. Inequality is part of capitalism. We understand that. There's going to be a certain amount of inequality in exchange for innovation. But, we've accepted these absurd levels of inequality while actually dismantling a lot of the regulations and a lot of the forms of progressive redistribution that we used to have. Bezos is not simply doing well while his workers aren't doing well. He's doing well because his workers aren't doing well. Right. I mean, in the first wave of the pandemic, he had huge numbers of warehouse workers laboring without any basic protective gear. He called them essential workers. He praised them for, saving other people's grandmothers, claimed publicly that he was prioritizing things like sanitizer, PPE, like face masks and hospital gowns, the very things that his workers didn't have. He was supposedly prioritizing them for customers. Now, I talked to Christian Smalls, this guy who led the labor uprising at this big warehouse in Staten Island in New York. And he specifically said, that's just nonsense. We can see what's going in the boxes. It's the same stuff as ever. He said, it's peanut butter and video game consoles and workout clothes and sex toys. Like, it's all the same stuff that people are piling up in the middle of a pandemic. And they actually doubled down in attacking Christian Smalls. Vice News got these notes of this meeting with Bezos and his general counsel where they actively tried to undermine him. They said, here's an African-American guy from Newark who's been working in warehouses all of his life. And at a meeting with Bezos, the general counsel says, to the extent to which we can focus attention on Christian Smalls, that's to our benefit because he's, quote, not intelligent or articulate. And by the way, when I pressed Amazon for explanation on this, they said, well, the general counsel regrets that phrase as if it's a gaffe and did not know Mr. Smalls' race when he said that.
Yeah, he regrets being caught is what he regrets.
Right. Yeah, that's right. And let's remember that Amazon has lobbied to avoid paid sick leave. So none of these forces that we're discussing are by accident. This is all according to Amazon's plan. Labor is a cost to be minimized so they can maximize returns to shareholders and then supposedly deliver the best prices to consumers, something they sometimes do and sometimes don't.
They also got a handout to have the facility in D.C., which is just utterly absurd. This competition to offer Amazon the most favorable government subsidy to headquarter in various places, when obviously he was going to do it in D.C. because he lives there. You didn't have to offer him anything, but we rolled out the red carpet. We being our government in terms of its generous gifts. Which is I love having Amazon here. I'm not anti-Amazon at all. I don't care how much money he makes, but the government doesn't need to also fund him to make this
choice. Socialism for the rich and rugged individualism for the poor.
That's right. It should be rugged individualism for everyone.
It underscores this idea. Davos Man has been hugely successful in convincing us and insinuating into our public discourse this idea that we can't prosper unless he prospers. And if he prospers, we live under the magic trickle down, which in reality has happened 0 times. But that's an elaborate way to justify continued tax cuts and continued policies that are favorable for people like Jeff Bezos and Steve Schwarzman at the cost of everybody else.
What's one of your other Davos men profiled in the book?
So Larry Fink, who's the world's largest asset manager. He, with Benioff, is a champion of this idea of stakeholder capitalism, this notion that they've popularized that, Milton Friedmanism is over. Companies are no longer just organized to return maximum profit to shareholders. Now they're thinking about the environment. They're thinking about local communities. They're thinking about labor, although left out of these constructions. And, Larry Fink every year releases this shareholder letter because his company now controls $10 trillion in assets. So he's essentially said, if you companies don't get right with climate change, if you don't treat your employees better, the markets will deprive you of capital. He's threatened shareholder votes, positioning himself as being sort of on the right side of history while he actually doesn't exercise his power most of the time on those votes. But, quietly, Fink has spent the pandemic squeezing poor countries like Argentina to pay up on his bonds, cutting healthcare, cutting government programs in the middle of this public health catastrophe to pay up Davos Man. And that's a part of his record that he doesn't care to talk about so much.
Well, the book is Davos Man, How the Billionaires Devoured the World. Peter Goodman, we are so grateful to have you here with us today. Thank you for
Thank you so much for your time.
Yes.
Appreciate it.
And we'll have more Rising right after this. Stay with us.